All right, guys, so here we are picking up where we left off from the prior video. We're going to be looking at the multiple production department rate method. Okay, so that's what we're going to be focusing on more specifically. How are we going to allocate factory overhead? Okay, so for the multiple production department factory overhead rate, that's a lot to say, of course. What makes this method a little bit different from the single plant wide rate method is you have now, as it states in its name, multiple departments, right? And so for this particular method, when you see or when there's a situation in which the departments differ significantly in the manufacturing process, factory overhead costs are normally incurred differently in each of those departments. So a good example of that the book gives or in the presentation gives is like the fabrication department compared to the assembly department. Now, if you don't know much about this, that's fine, but the fabrication department is usually in charge of cutting things, right? They're cutting the wood or the metal and things like that. So maybe it's requiring more machine hours or more machinery and, accumulated depreciation and utilities, right? However, for the assembly department, their process is a little bit different because they're more labor intensive, right? Assembly requires, people to, glue things together, to carve it or to screw it in, things like that. The assembly department is less likely to probably use a lot of machinery hours or the machine time, and it's less likely to use up a lot of utilities because again, it's not labor, it's not machine intensive, it's not consuming a lot of the electricity other than like just having the lights on, right? So people can see. So again, under the multiple production department method, this one is separating out each of the different departments, and it's kind of giving you a more detailed dive into the process. So this process is a little more accurate than the prior method that we looked at before, and it uses different rates for each of the departments, okay? So let's dive into this with a bit of an example because sometimes that's a better way to get across the point. So assume that Ruiz Company uses the following two production departments in the manufacturing of snowmobiles and riding mowers. You have your fabrication department, which I tried to explain in the prior slide. The fabrication department cuts metal to the shape of the product. And then you have the assembly department, which manually assembles pieces into a final product. So even just reading through the descriptions of the departments, you can tell that they probably are using factory overhead a lot different, right? So here's our information. So if you are following along with me, we are continuing our example. We're just kind of adding more detail as we move along. So it says the total budgeted factory overhead for Ruiz was 1.6 million, and it's divided into these two departments. You have the fabrication and the assembly department. And so as we did with the single plant wide rate method, it was still the 1.6 million, but now what we have done is further divided up into each of the departments, right? So as you can see, as I tried to allude to earlier, the fabrication department is using up a lot more of the factory overhead costs in the assembly department. And that's simply because, again, machines tend to use up more utilities, right? More power. They tend to use up more like depreciation, right? And so for your assembly department, they're not using up as much factory overhead as the other one. Okay. All right. So when we're using the doing the multiple production department method, here's our formula. It looks very, very similar to our single plant wide rate method, except we're dividing this all up by departments. That's the key thing here. By departments, we have made it more accurate and more detail oriented. So assume that Ruiz Company uses direct labor hours as the allocation base, remembering that I told you there's 3 different allocation bases that hopefully you learned about in chapter 2. And those 3 is machine hours, it is direct labor hours, and then direct labor cost. So in this particular example, they're telling you that this company uses direct labor hours. Of the 3 that we know, this is the one that's more prevalent or relevant for their situation. So they're using direct labor hours as the allocation base for the fabrication and assembly department. Each department uses 10,000 direct labor hours. Thus, the factory overhead rate is as follows. All right, so I'm gonna have to kind of erase some of this, sorry. All right, so anyways, here is how, again, you already know this part from what I showed you. So for the fabrication department, the way we go about calculating the factory overhead rate for just that department is we're going to take the budgeted factory overhead cost for the entire year divided by their direct labor hour. And again, they said they use 10,000 direct labor hours. And so there, for the fabrication department, it's $103 per direct labor hour. And now we're going to do the exact same thing for the assembly department. The assembly department, the factory overhead cost was $570,000. So here it is, and it's being here, right? And then they said that each department uses 10,000 hours. So that's why we have 10,000 here again. And so once we do this calculation, it comes out to $57 per direct labor hours. Okay, so now let's see, now that we have figured out what is our factory overhead rate for each department, remember we must now allocate these rates to each of the products, right? So you can imagine that for the snowmobile and for the riding mower, they both have to go through the fabrication department and the assembly department, right? All right, so here's the information that we need. So again, our 2 products is the snowmobile and the riding mower, right? And both of them, in order for them to be completed, both the snowmobile and the riding mower must go through both of these departments, both the fabrication department and assembly department. And it's showing you their split out or their breakout of the time that's being spent, the time that's being spent in each department. So for the snowmobile, they spend more time in the fabrication department, which is the cutting department, than in the assembly department, which is 2 hours. And then on the other end of this, the riding mower, it spends more time in the assembly department at 8 hours than it does in the fabrication department, okay? All right, so don't forget the rates that we've already calculated in the first step. So then we're gonna continue. So now here's the part where we're gonna go ahead and now allocate these rates that we've already figured out. We're gonna allocate these rates to the time each product is spent in each department. Hopefully that makes sense. So let's take, for instance, only the snowmobile for now, right? That's what we're gonna look at first. So again, the snowmobile must go through both the fabrication department and the assembly department, and the breakdown is here, right? So here's my 8 and 2 hours. And then these are the rates that we've already figured out in step 1 of the process. So we're gonna apply it across the board. And so once we do 8 direct labor hours times the 103 per direct labor hour overhead rate, we come up with 824. And then we do the same thing for the assembly department. This too is coming from here, right? And then we've already figured this out because the assembly department's overhead rate comes from here. And so once we do the calculation across, we come out to $114. So once we add both of those up, the amount that we're going to allocate to factory overhead for the snowmobile will be $938. And then we're going to do the same thing for the riding mower. All of that information is provided here, and we're going to use these rates, right? And so that's how we come up with this. Okay, so hopefully I didn't lose you guys, but it really, the first start of the process is you need to find out what is the multiple department factory overhead rate per department. And then once you get that, you'll need to know the breakdown of each product's time spent in each department, and then you can multiply it across. Okay, so I think the best way to go about doing this is to take a second and see if we can see if you can walk through this example. Now, again, I know the answer is kind of listed here, but again, challenge yourself to go through this example to see where you're maybe missing it or you're like, hey, I'm not quite getting it. Okay, so I really encourage you guys to take a look at the handout. Here we are at part B or section B. We're doing the multiple production department rate method. We're on example number 2, and we're going to be filling out all of this. Okay, so take a second, do that, and then we're going to come back together and go through it.